So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon as we actually continue to pay tribute to one of our own, Lieutenant Colonel Mark Bonica, who will be departing shortly. So very briefly, just to let you in on kind of what's happening behind the scenes before we come to today, is that when we talked to Mark about what we wanted to do for his retirement, this is what he wanted. So he didn't want the retirement ceremony. As a matter of fact, he pushed back very hard on having anything official. Thankfully, we were able to kind of win and negotiate and get to the point where we could have that this afternoon at lunchtime. But this is really what he wanted. So he wanted a last lecture to give to the faculty and students. If you guys think back, several years ago, Randy Pausch actually had a book that he wrote called The Last Lecture. Mark is not dying, okay? He's as far as I am aware, he's in good health, and he's going to do great things. But this is an opportunity to kind of give you his parting thoughts. Now, he's told me that this is not academic. This is really his thoughts that he wanted to leave with the students moving forward. We are capturing this on video, and so we'll be able to share this, and the family will be able to have a copy moving forward. So without further ado, Colonel Bonica.
Thank you everybody for indulging me this afternoon. I asked Forrest to set up this final farewell lecture, mostly so that I would have to put into words some of the thoughts that I've been working with for a long time. The title of this lecture comes from a Japanese phrase from the martial arts, Bun-bu ichi, which means in English, the sword and the brush are one. I'll return to that phrase shortly. I've subtitled this talk, Toward a Worthy Life, and as with many subtexts, this is really the topic I want to talk to you about. You might ask, what does Bonica have to say about a worthy life? Who is he to talk to me about such a topic? And I am afraid you would be quite right to indulge in such skepticism. By way of acknowledging your insight, I'd like to quote the great Stoic philosopher Lucius Annaeus Seneca, writing in about 60 AD. I'm talking to you here as if I were lying in the same hospital ward about the illness we're both suffering from and passing on some remedies. So listen to me as if I were speaking to myself. I'm allowing you access to my inmost self, calling you in to advise me as I have things out with myself. So I won't pretend to have the insight that Seneca had, but I will borrow from him liberally, which is the gift that great minds of literature leave us, a record of the insights they were able to make that we less gifted can hopefully draw on and work with as we work towards something worthy. My goal today is to share with you a bit of some of the conclusions that I've come to and some of my personal goals. To have things out with myself a bit, as Seneca said, and to do it in front of you so that hopefully I will be a little less self-indulgent and that hopefully maybe later you can give me some of your own advice on where I have gone wrong. I have inserted the word toward into the subtitle purposely. I don't claim that I have final answers, but I am working on the question. I have some thoughts. I have to admit I've failed to live up to these things that I am going to suggest make a worthy life more often than not. But that is again why I have toward in the subtitle. Today's talk is an invitation to dialogue. I hope you will follow up with me and tell me what you think was right and where you think I have gone wrong. Maybe together we can work toward a better answer. So that said, I believe we are enjoined to seek the worthy life by society. For me, the enjoinder comes from both the religious and the secular. The author of the Gospel of Matthew was a contemporary of Seneca, and the Gospel was probably written down during Seneca's lifetime. In the Gospel of Matthew, we find the parable of the talents, which many of you are probably familiar with, and it's one of the stories of the Bible that I often reflect on. To briefly summarize, the parable of the talents tells of a master who went off on a trip. He had 3 slaves, each of whom he gave a certain number of talents of gold. A talent was a measure of gold in the time. And to the first he gave 5 talents, the second 2 talents, and the last one he gave 1 talent. The first 2 slaves each took their talents and made investments. When the master returned, they were able to report that they had taken what they had started out with and doubled their master's gifts. The master's response to the first two slaves is roughly the same. He says to each, "Well done, good and faithful servant. Thou hast been faithful over a few things. I will make thee ruler over many things. Enter thou into the joy of the Lord." The third slave, with only one talent, chose to dig a hole and hide his talent and afraid to lose. As a result, when he was called to report what he had done with his gift, he was forced to report that he had done nothing. The master then takes the talent from him and gives it to the wealthiest slave and throws him out into the darkness. This is the religious enjoinder to lead the worthy life. We have an obligation to God to seek the worthy life and to use our talents and gifts to the fullest. The secular enjoinder, I believe, is well captured by this poem by Mary Oliver. Some of you may be familiar with it. It is called The Summer Day, and it goes like this. Who made the world? Who made the swan and the black bear? Who made the grasshopper? This grasshopper, I mean. The one who has flung herself out of the grass, the one who is eating sugar out of my hand, who is moving her jaws back and forth instead of up and down, who is gazing around with her enormous and complicated eyes. Now she lifts her pale forearms and thoroughly washes her face. Now she snaps her wings open and floats away. I don't know exactly what a prayer is. I do know how to pay attention. How to fall down into the grass, how to kneel down in the grass, how to be idle and blessed, how to stroll through the fields, which is what I have been doing all day. To me, what else should I have done? Tell me, what else should I have done? Doesn't everything die at last and too soon? Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life? The secular enjoinder tells us we have an obligation to ourselves to seek the worthy life. We have one life, and we need to treat it as something wild and precious, and not to waste it. We are called then by the religious and the secular to use our gifts, the greatest gift being the gift of life, and to fulfill the goal of a worthy life. I'll return to Seneca, Matthew, and Mary again later, but now I want to move on to someone you may be more familiar with. For those of you who don't recognize him, this is Steve Carell, an American actor who has appeared in a number of movies such as Anchorman, The 40-Year-Old Virgin, and my favorite, Bruce Almighty. But I think perhaps his most enduring role will be this one as Michael Scott, the boss of a sales office in a make-believe firm, Dunder Mifflin, for a show called The Office. Now, Candy and I don't watch much TV, not because it's evil, though that's debatable, but because we're just basically too busy. However, Candy does like to watch a little TV at night when she's getting ready for bed, and I am sort of a collateral watcher. If it's on, I have a hard time not watching it, so I often catch a little bit of whatever she happens to be watching at the time, and for a while, The Office was one of those shows that was on at the right time of night, and I occasionally caught snippets of it. So now for a quick orientation for those of you not familiar with the show, which would include my father, I guess, and maybe some others. We have Michael, played by Carell, who is passionate and completely incompetent, and a socially inept boss. It is his well-meaning missteps and utter inability to be appropriately self-reflective that create the circumstances for humor in this show. Dwight, by Rainn Wilson, is either completely psychotic, working with a reality none of us perceive, or completely sane, and the rest of us are completely psychotic. To me, The Office is something directly out of Jean-Paul Sartre's 1944 play, No Exit, for those of you that are familiar with that play. If it is an accurate depiction of life, then you could see Dwight's off-kilter responses as a completely healthy response to an insane world. How else should we act when you realize you have woken up in the Mad Hatter's Tea Party? Then, of course, you have Pam, played by Jennifer Fisher, who doesn't seem quite smart enough to know she's in a dysfunctional organization, and Jim, her boyfriend, played by John Krasinski, who seems smart enough to realize seems smart enough to realize the organization is dysfunctional, but ironically resolved to at once be of it and above it. And then there's this guy, who I don't recognize because I don't really watch the show, and frankly I had to look up most of that information I just gave you anyway. And I didn't see his picture in the cast list I looked for. But this shot captures my point in using The Office. He's looking out at the camera with a complete realization that the things going on around him are completely pointless. I can hear him saying, "Oh my God, I hate my job. I hate the people I work with. I hate my life. I am trapped." No exit, as Sartre would have said. So why do we as a society laugh at The Office? The author Robert Heinlein puts the following words into his character, Michael Valentine Smith, who, by the way, is is a human raised by Martians, and so you really need to read the book to grok this, in his classic book, Stranger in a Strange Land, which I recommend, by the way. He says this: "I've found out why people laugh. They laugh because it hurts so much, because it's the only thing that will make it stop hurting. I had been told that a funny thing is a thing of goodness. It isn't. Not ever is it funny to the person it happens to. The goodness is in the laughing itself." I grok, which he uses to mean I understand. "It is a bravery and a sharing against pain and sorrow and defeat." When I first read that Heinlein quote, that we only laugh at the things that are painful, I didn't want to believe it. He goes on in the story to say that we smile at good things. We smile, not laugh, at babies and flowers and kind acts, but we don't laugh at them. I wouldn't accept his statement as a perfect universal, but I think it's pretty close to truth after I've reflected on this. Often we laugh at clever things like puns, for example, because we didn't see it coming, which is a way of acknowledging our own ignorance, which is not quite pain, but something close to it. But I think we laugh at The Office for the reasons Heinlein describes, because too many of us are the guy on the left side of the screen. Or we work with people who are the guy on the left side of the screen. It's probably appropriate that I don't even have a name for him. That way we can put our own names in for him. An episode of The Office, in my opinion, is like watching a slow-moving train wreck. There's nothing you can do to stop it, and you can't look away. The fact that most of the characters are either incapable or unwilling to engage in self-reflection and self-examination makes us laugh. We reflexively examine and resolve their mistakes. We know that Michael is doing, we know what Michael is doing in every show is absolutely wrong, and we laugh because we see the discomfort and the pain that he causes in others. But it's only funny because it has some truth to it. We've all found ourselves stuck in circumstances where the leaders are like Michael, inept, incompetent, or worse, and we have all found ourselves in organizations that are like Dunder Mifflin, where we are indifferent to the purpose, numbed by the work, and generally watching the clock tick the minutes until the end of the day when we can leave, when we could get to what we considered our real life. Perhaps we look forward to doing some hobby, going to the gym, spending time with friends, or just going home and watching TV. I first read Henry David Thoreau's Walden when I was doing just this sort of job. I should have been grateful for the opportunity in retrospect, and had I learned some of the lessons I would like to share with you, I might have been. In the summer after high school, I got a job at the local YMCA as the towel boy. My two primary duties as the towel boy were, one, to walk through the facility twice each hour to make sure all the external doors were secure and that no one was damaging or stealing the equipment or doing anything else that would harm the facility, and two, to wash the towels that we provided to the members for their use in the locker room. It was an incredibly dull job. The washing machines were in a windowless room in the basement. When I wasn't walking my beat, my boss told me I could sit in the laundry room and wait for the towels, and he was okay with me reading. So I did a lot of reading that summer between my rounds and my loads of laundry. And in that windowless basement was where I first read Thoreau. I think the words of Thoreau give us some insight into the humor of The Office. You know, Thoreau was writing in the 1840s, so you should keep this in mind. And it kind of shows how very little has changed. The mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation. A stereotyped but unconscious despair is concealed even under what are called the games and amusements of mankind. There is no play in them, for this comes after work, but it is characteristic of wisdom not to do desperate things. Despair is exactly what I see when I look at the guy on the left. Sorry. Okay. There is no play in him. He is simply waiting to get away from the office, from his boss, and from his colleagues. Anything would be better than sitting at that table. Without knowing his character, we can fill in a storyline that is appropriate from our lives. He needed a job. This is the job with the best salary, the best benefits, working conditions, etc. that he could get, and so he took it. Maybe he needs the life insurance, the health insurance, so he can't leave. Maybe he's waiting for his 401k to invest. If this was a military setting, perhaps he's at year 14, like maybe some of you, and too many years in to leave, and yet what he feels like another lifetime in front of him before he can retire and do what he wants. Hopefully not like you. He would tell us he doesn't really have a choice. And here's what Thoreau says about that line of thinking, and it has echoed with me as I look at my own life. But men labor under a mistake. The better part of the man is soon plowed into the soil for compost. By a seeming fate commonly called necessity, they are employed, as it says in an old book, laying up treasures which moth and rust will corrupt and thieves will break through and steal. It is a fool's life, as they will find when they get to the end of it, if not before. It is our misrepresentation to ourselves about what is necessary versus what is luxury that ultimately leads to quite a bit of our sense of despair. We allow ourselves to long for things, to accumulate things, and sooner than later we are working to maintain those things. I bought a lovely big house out in Cibolo with a pool. The house, though practically new, has been nothing but a money sink, as I have joked about with many of you. A new water heater, a new air conditioner, a new retaining wall for the pool, plumbing repairs, drywall repairs, painting, another new retaining wall for the pool. If you take the cost of all these repairs and calculate how many hours of my life and wages it took to pay for all this, well, I don't know about you, but I start to get depressed. A great many hours of my life have been spent caring and feeding for this material thing. Reality is that we need a certain amount of things to survive and to have a comfortable life. But when we go beyond what we need, we are working to maintain and care for those things, rather than those things working for us. I need more money because I have more stuff, so I have to work harder and longer. Or as Thoreau said, when the farmer has got his house, he may not be the richer but the poorer for it, and it be the house that has got him. We laugh at the office because it reflects back to us what I would consider to be unexamined lives. We laugh at Michael because although he exudes genuine passion and drive and a zest for some sort of life, he is pathologically unable to learn from the feedback that he gets from his failures. He rarely stops long enough to appreciate the nature of his failures, and when he does, he fails to appropriately process and learn from them. He never really examines what he is doing in a way that will create a positive feedback loop so that he can avoid making similar mistakes in the future. There we go. In Plato's Apology, Socrates is famously quoted as saying, "The unexamined life is not worth living." Michael is an extreme example of such a life. The unexamined life is going to be filled with activities, commitments, and things that are worthless. It isn't just Michael who is living an unexamined life. The rest of the people, with the possible exception of Dwight, also fail to adequately examine what they are doing. Do any of them really need the job that they have at Dunder Mifflin so badly that they should willingly subject themselves to the nonsense that life in the office represents? This is why we laugh not just at Michael, but the whole show. It is the environment and the endurance of the characters that elicits our laughter. It elicits our laughter because it reflects the pain we feel from the meaningless in our own lives, especially for those of us who have worked in an environment like the office. We laugh because we sympathize with the characters. We could imagine changing places with Jim. We laugh to the degree that we are Jim. So please don't get me wrong. There's nothing wrong with working in an office. I did it for years, and for most of the time I found it, on average, fulfilling, especially once I found my way into resource management work. There is also nothing wrong with working sales, the job the characters of the office are engaged in. Sales is no less respectable than any other profession. There is a right profession for everyone. There is also nothing wrong with the office or liking the office. It's clever television. But the question to pose ourselves is, why do we find ourselves living lives that lack meaning? Because that is why I believe we find the office and shows like it funny. Why are we the unnamed character with the red arrow? I can only imagine this character waking up on Monday morning with a pit in his stomach, advocating for policies of work-life balance. Why do we have discussions about work-life balance? Discussions of work-life balance imply some sort of dysfunctional separation between work and life. Work is part of life. If your work is entirely instrumental to you, then you are doing something wrong. If you find your questions of work, if you find you have questions of work-life balance, you should carefully consider if you are living an unexamined life. Adam Smith, the father of modern economics and the patron saint of capitalism, you may be surprised, was convinced in the 1750s, 100 years before Thoreau, that humanity was already fooled by this illusion of necessity. For to what purpose is all the toil and bustle of this world? What is the end of avarice and ambition, of the pursuit of wealth, of power and preeminence? Is it to supply the necessities of nature? The wages of the meanest labor can supply them. We see that they afford him food and clothing, the comfort of a house and of a family. If we examined his economy with rigor, we should find that he spends a great part of them upon conveniences which may be regarded as superfluities, and that upon extraordinary occasions he can give something even to vanity and distinction. Our standard of what is minimally necessary has risen a great deal since Adam Smith's day. We no longer regard what can be bought by the wages of the meanest laborer as acceptable standard of living. Indoor plumbing, heat, electricity, privacy, cutting-edge healthcare, a car, and of course a smartphone are all the things we regard as minimal standards. It would be difficult to procure this for a family of 4 on a minimum wage today, of course, but except for the very bottom of our wealth distribution in the United States, everyone enjoys a standard of living today that exceeds the kings and queens of Smith's era. Could you live with less? Almost certainly, everyone in this room could. Would you want to? No. We spend quite a bit of money as a result, and our time, on superfluities, as Smith called them. We work hard to maintain those superfluities. The question is why? Why do so many of us spend our days pursuing jobs and pursuing promotions and pursuing the next thing? To get the nice house, to get the nice car, to get the nice clothes, to go eat out in nice restaurants, etc. We spend our lives acquiring things, far more things than we need to survive. So the answer that Smith gives us with regard to this is this. We desire to be both respectable and respected. We dread both to be contemptible and to be contemned. But upon coming into the world, we soon find that wisdom and virtue are by no means the sole objects of respect, nor vice and folly of contempt. We frequently see that the respectful attentions of the world are more strongly directed toward the rich and great than towards the wise and virtuous. So we want to be respected and we want to be the thing that is respectable, but society sends out confusing signals about what it is that's worthy of respect. We conflate wealth and fame with virtue. Is Bill Gates virtuous? I actually don't know. I do know he's rich. And so therefore admired. So Smith goes on. We see frequently the vices and follies of the powerful, much less despised than the poverty and weakness of the innocent. To deserve, to acquire, and to enjoy the respect and admiration of mankind are the great objects of ambition and emulation. We pursue wealth, in other words, because wealth is external. It works as a signal. We're hardwired, Smith says, to respect the wealthy and the powerful, even them. This is why magazines like People, Us, Entertainment Weekly sell off the shelves. The royalty of Smith's day have been replaced by the Kardashians, the Miley Cyruses, and the Paris Hiltons of today. You have to work hard to overcome the prejudice we have to favor the wealthy and the famous. Smith further says, they are the wise and virtuous chiefly, a select, though I am afraid, very small party, who are the real and steady admirers, but a small party, who are the real and steady admirers of wisdom and virtue. The great mob of mankind are admirers and worshippers, and what may seem more extraordinary, most frequently disinterested admirers and worshippers of wealth and greatness. Virtue is internal. It is impossible to tell at a glance whether someone is worthy of respect, but you can tell if their handbag or their car or their jacket are expensive. The mob, the great mass of people, cannot distinguish virtue, though. They mistake wealth and celebrity for virtue. We know one does not necessarily map to the other. Seneca has a similar sentiment. The many speak highly of you, but have you really any grounds for satisfaction with yourself if you are the kind of person that the many understand? Your merits should not be outward-facing. Wealth is outward-facing. Celebrity is outward-facing. Virtue is inward-facing and takes time and effort to discern. Even when we know a person lacks virtue, like a Trump or a Kardashian, we still give them recognition. We willingly give them the most valuable external thing in the world, our attention. Smith says, the rich man glories in his riches because he feels that they naturally draw upon him the attention of the world. A lack of attention is the thing we dread more than anything else. It is, according to Smith, a human being's most ardent desire. The poor man, on the contrary, is ashamed of his poverty. He feels that it either places him out of the sight of mankind, or that if they take any notice of him, they have, however, scarce any fellow feeling with the misery and distress which he suffers. He is mortified upon both accounts, for though to be overlooked and to be disapproved of are things entirely different, yet as obscurity covers us from the daylight of honor and approbation, to feel that we are taken no notice of necessarily damps the most agreeable hope, and disappoints the most ardent desire of human nature. The poor man goes out and comes unheeded, and when in the midst of a crowd is in the same obscurity as if he is shut up in his hovel. That was Smith. I have referred so far primarily to philosophical literature, but there is an extensive literature in the health economics field that shows a connection between health and socioeconomic status, which many of you are probably familiar with. Examples include 2 10-year studies of British civil servants working at Whitehall that showed those with higher status jobs had better health outcomes, especially around diseases related to sustained stress, such as heart disease. It's stressful to believe that you are unimportant, that you are overlooked, irrelevant, shut up in obscurity even when you are in the midst of a crowd. It's more than just soul-crushing to go to work every day to a job where you count the hours until you till you can escape. It also crushes the body to be ignored. Ultimately, Smith says, what we want is to be observed, to be attended to be taken notice of with sympathy and complacency, and approbation. These are all the advantages which we can propose to derive from it. It is the vanity, not the ease or the pleasure, which interests us. So we acquire things so that we can be seen. When work does not provide us for that sense of esteem from being seen, we look elsewhere for it. We look for substitutes. But this isn't the answer. Material objects don't fill in for lack of meaning. To compensate for another day of being ignored, we demand another thing. But one thing leads to another, and soon the things own us, and we work to maintain our things. We extend ourselves beyond our income and only find ourselves more miserable. We labor under a mistake, as Thoreau said. We try to find meaning in the office when the office is not where we were meant to be. So far, I've largely talked about negative worth, and this is probably starting to sound a bit like a Dave Ramsey seminar. Ramsey is, in fact, a Stoic, and I approve of his message. I think he's modernized much of their perspective on material wealth, so he's worth reading. But I want to start building my argument for a positive theory of a worthy life. That theory begins with justice. Aristotle divided justice into 2 categories: commutative justice and distributive justice. The scholastics, who were Middle Ages philosophers, up through the Renaissance thinkers such as Hugo Grotius, and ultimately the philosophers of Scottish Enlightenment who were deeply influential on the American founding fathers such as Carmichael, Hutcheson, and of course Adam Smith. Although today we remember Smith primarily for his book, The Wealth of Nations, he'd already been famous across Europe for nearly 20 years for his first book, The Theory of the Moral Sentiments, which deals with questions of justice and the good life. I will focus on Smith's interpretation because I'm the most familiar with his, and I happen to think it's right. According to Smith, commutative justice correlates with those obligations and duties which we can be coerced to perform with perfect justice, and if we fail to perform them, we can be punished with violence. According to Smith, if we violate the rules of commutative justice according to Smith, we violate the rules of commutative justice when we intentionally injure someone. He says, the violation of justice is injury. It does real and positive hurt to some particular persons from motives which are naturally disapproved of. It is therefore the proper object of resentment and of punishment, which is the natural consequence of resentment, as mankind goes along with and approves of the violence employed to avenge the hurt which is done by injustice, so they much more go along with and approve of that which is employed to prevent and beat off the injury and to restrain the offender from hurting his neighbors. So Smith and his predecessors include in commutative justice the natural rights of life, liberty, and property. A willful violation of one of those is a violation of commutative justice, and it gives the victim the right to respond with necessary violence, including retributional punishment. Smith and other thinkers who endorse this dichotomy often refer to commutative justice as a negative virtue, which means most of the time you can fully satisfy what is required by the rules of commutative justice simply by sitting still and doing nothing. In other words, if you don't knock your neighbor over the head with a stick and take his stuff, you're pretty much in compliance with commutative justice. As that example hopefully demonstrates, the rules of commutative justice are generally quite clear. Don't hurt anyone. Don't take their stuff. Let them marry who they want to marry. Let them live where they want to live. Don't try to block them from doing what they want to do, so long as they aren't violating any commutative justice rules themselves. Smith compares the rules of commutative justice to the rules of grammar, and he refers to them as precise, accurate, and indispensable. The rules of commutative justice can be learned like a grammar. As Smith says, a man may learn to write grammatically by rule with most absolute infallibility, and so perhaps he may be taught to act justly. But like grammar, commutative justice is not particularly interesting. If we learn the grammar of justice, the principles of commutative justice, we can learn to behave justly, but not virtuously. As with writing, simply knowing the rules of grammar will make you an adequate writer. People will understand you, but knowing the rules of grammar does not make you a praiseworthy writer. Knowing how to use a semicolon properly will not make you a poet. Likewise, being perfectly in compliance with commutative justice is not particularly praiseworthy. You don't thank me in the morning for not carjacking you on the way to work. I don't thank you for not capping me and taking my wallet. The control of violence in society is not a small thing, and it has plagued human civilization since the beginning of time. Smith calls commutative justice the main pillar that upholds the whole edifice of society. If it is removed, he says, the immense fabric of human society, that fabric which to raise and support seems in this world, if I may say so, to have been the peculiar and darling care of nature, must in a moment crumble into atoms. As I said, it's a negative virtue. You can be perfectly in line with it by sitting still. Being in compliance with commutative justice is the baseline for a worthy life. If you violate commutative justice, everything else you do is negated. The sad accusations that Mr. Bill Cosby currently faces, for example, are an example of this truth. I doubt we will ever get resolution of the charges Mr. Cosby faces, but if we do, and we find out they are true, then everything else that he has stood for, all the benevolence that he is known for, will be negated because he violated the principles of commutative justice. Being in compliance with commutative justice simply allows us to continue to be allowed to be part of society and nothing more. By our humanity and by our compliance with commutative justice, we are regarded as being worthy of being left to ourselves unmolested, but no more than that. Simply being worthy of not being expelled from community is hardly the worthy life we long for. Since moving toward the worthy life is what I'm talking about here, let's talk about how we move beyond that baseline. To live a worthy life, we must begin to seek the second type of justice, distributive justice. Grotius defines distributive justice as proper beneficence, in the becoming use of what is our own, and in applying it to those purposes either of charity or generosity to which it is most suitable in our situation that it should be applied. So that's a convoluted 17th century sentence. What it means is distributive justice is all about how we use our own stuff. While the rules of commutative justice primarily govern how we treat other people's stuff and other people, distributive justice is all about how we distribute our own stuff. how we use the gifts and privileges we are endowed with. I'd like to quote again from the Gospel of Matthew. As I said, Matthew is a contemporary of Seneca. It's interesting to read Matthew because his gospel is not the cuddly version of Christianity most of us endorse today, but with a fluffy day-glow Jesus. Matthew demands something of us. That demand is the demand of distributive justice. And for me, the parable of the sheep and the goats is perhaps the most powerful statement of what is required of us to meet the demands of distributive justice. And it goes like this. Then the king will say to those on his right, "Come you who were blessed by my Father, take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you invited me in. I needed clothes and you clothed me. I was sick and you looked after me. I was in prison and you came and visited me." Then the righteous will answer him, "Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you as a stranger and invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and go to visit you?" And the king will reply, "Truly I tell you, what you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me." The principles of distributive justice are not grammatical. They are not rule governed by, like principles of commutative justice. The one thing that is absolutely true about beneficence is that it cannot be extorted by force. You must choose to be beneficent. Beneficence is also absolutely individualized. Smith says these principles are more like those that govern the appreciation of art. They are loose, vague, and indeterminate, and present to us rather with a general idea of the perfection we ought to aim at than afford us any certain and infallible directions for acquiring it. Like the judge who once said, "I may not be able to define art, but I know it when I see it," we cannot know in advance what right beneficence is until we are faced with the particulars of a situation. If two men give $100 to a charity, and one is a private in the Army, and the other is Warren Buffett, these acts should not be regarded as equally virtuous from a distributive justice perspective. When a person is in danger, distributive justice generally impels us to try to help them if we can. When a person is hungry, distributive justice generally instructs us to feed them if we can. When a person is lonely, distributive justice generally instructs us to offer them company if we can. Note my use of generally, and if we can. Distributive justice is always situation dependent. They depend on the relationship and the relative status of each party involved. If a person is in danger and you can get them out of danger with no danger to yourself, then almost certainly you should do so. If the person is in danger, if the person in danger is in danger through his own imprudence, and it is likely that you might be killed if you try to help them, and you are the father or mother of 3 young children who would be left to society to be raised, is it proper beneficence for you to put yourself at risk for this person? Perhaps. If you're a police officer or a firefighter or a soldier or a sailor or an airman, then maybe yes, because you have taken on that responsibility and you had better have prepared your family that your job may cost them your support. Otherwise, it's hard to know. Proper beneficence does not have bright lines that govern conduct. Should I rob a bank? Are there conditions under which robbing a bank would not be a violation of commutative justice? Almost certainly not. You would have to dream up all sorts of parameters that would change our common understanding of bank to some sort of evil actor. Without engaging in those kinds of mental gymnastics, you are not going to be able to find easy exceptions to commutative justice. But distributive justice requires constant analysis. Every situation is different. Generosity, for example, is generally a virtue, but it ceases being a virtue if it cultivates dependency or enables the continuance of bad conduct. Even excessive generosity can be a fault. A person who gives away all his money fails to provide for himself. As a result, he must now rely on the beneficence of others, an unfair situation. This is not the becoming use of one's own, and although it seems an act of generosity at first glance, it is actually a violation of distributive justice. Smith, drawing on the Stoics, says, "Every man is first and principally recommended to his own care, and every man is certainly, in every respect, fitter and abler to take care of himself than any other person. You know what you need to survive better than anyone else, taking care of your needs. your true needs, and not your vanity, is the first principle of distributive justice. Can you provide yourself shelter, food, and clothing? Basic self-reliance for me has always been the mark of adulthood. The transition from being a child to being an adult is marked by the ability to generally provide for yourself. We are flawed and highly imperfect individuals. Alone, it is difficult to improve ourselves. Once you have examined your own life and recognized your own weaknesses, one of the first steps towards self-improvement is to find people you admire and associate with them. This is another reason why you should flee any environment that resembles the office. Associating with people who you do not respect will bring your character lower. Seneca says, "Associate with people who are likely to improve you. Welcome those whom you are capable of improving. The process is a mutual fund. Is a mutual one, not a mutual fund. The process is a mutual one. Men learn as they teach." I am a finance teacher. Little slip there. Austin Kleon, poet, artist, and author of Steal Like an Artist, said it well in contemporary English. "You are a mashup of the things you let into your life." The German poet Goethe said, "We are shaped and fashioned by what we love. If we love material things, we will be shaped by their very mortality. Choose wisely what and who you will allow to shape you." I believe our popular culture maligns or at least minimizes the virtue of prudence. But a respect for prudence, a belief that you should be and in fact are responsible for your own well-being first, is a value that I believe is critical for living a worthy life. Smith says, "The care of the health, of the fortune, of the rank, and the reputation of the individual, the objects upon which his comfort and happiness in this life are supposed principally to depend, is considered as the proper business of that virtue which is commonly called prudence." Like commutative justice, prudence alone is not particularly praiseworthy, though. However, before you can begin to think about providing for others, you must achieve a certain level of self-reliance. And you only ensure that through developing a proper sense of prudence. As Smith goes on later, "The man who acts according to the rules of perfect prudence, of strict justice, and of proper benevolence may be said to be perfectly virtuous." Prudence is a virtue because it reduces our reliance on chance. To be properly virtuous with respect to distributive justice, we must take care that we do not unnecessarily expose ourselves to chance. As a result, throw ourselves on the benevolence of others. In one of my favorite passages in The Prince, Machiavelli considers the role of chance in life. "It is not unknown to me how many men have, and still have, the opinion that the affairs of the world are in such a way governed by fortune and by God that men with their wisdom cannot direct them, and that no one can even help them. And because of this, they would have us believe that it is not necessary to labor much in affairs, but to let chance govern them. This opinion has been credited in our times because of the great changes in affairs which have been seen, and may still be seen every day beyond all human conjecture. Sometimes, pondering over this, I am in some degree inclined to their opinion. Nevertheless, not to extinguish our free will, I hold it to be true that fortune is the arbiter of one half of our actions, but that she still leaves us to direct the other half, or perhaps a little less. I think you can usefully read The Prince through the lens of prudence. Machiavelli is ultimately a conservative. Like Dr. Mangelsdorf says, he's a survivor. Much of life is beyond our control, but we have an obligation to control what portion of it we can. Accepting this obligation is part of the virtue of prudence. I would not recommend much of the advice Machiavelli offers in The Prince to anyone who wishes to live what I consider to be a worthy life, except perhaps this perspective on chance. Nassim Taleb, a PhD in quantitative finance, a successful financial trader, and the author of books Fooled by Randomness, The Black Swan, and most recently my favorite, Anti-Fragile, has written extensively on the problem of chance in life and how we often mistake chance outcomes for the result of skill or hard work. The subject of his work is ultimately prudence. A mistake, Taleb says, is not something to be determined after the fact, but in light of information until that point. If we properly understand the risk involved with an action, and we take that action and fail, failure is not a mistake. Being in the World Trade Center on September 11th, 2001 was not a mistake, it was just bad luck. We could not have predicted that someone would hijack a jet and fly it into the heart of New York City. A mistake implies bad judgment given prior knowledge. If we take our life savings to Las Vegas and we bet it all on red at the roulette table, that is a mistake, regardless of the outcome. It does not matter if the outcome was red and we doubled our money. The mistake is to take the action with the knowledge that we are gambling our future self-reliance. Such an action is imprudent and not virtuous. There are circumstances where gambling all is called for and could be regarded as virtuous, but these are rare, and a worthy life is not built around seeking them out. Taleb's Anti-Fragile offers an interesting insight into the problem of prudence and going beyond prudence. Taleb draws extensively on his experience as a financial trader in his writing. He offers us three related concepts: fragility, robustness, and a new idea, anti-fragility. By fragility, Taleb means its conventional meaning, something that is easily broken or destroyed. A teacup made from fine china can be easily broken by dropping it just a few inches to a hard surface. As a fragile thing, the teacup is harmed by sudden stress. In this case, the sudden change in height from 6 inches above a hard surface to sudden contact with the surface. We might tend to think of robustness, the ability to survive stress, as the opposite of fragility. Indeed, if we contrast a steel travel mug with a fine china teacup, we could see that the travel mug would not be in the least bothered by a drop from 6 inches above a hard surface. The worst that might happen is a small dent, but even that is unlikely. And even if it were to get a small dent, the travel mug would still largely be fine. Whose travel mug hasn't earned a few scratches and dents from being dropped going to or from the car? The virtue of prudence is like making oneself a steel travel mug instead of a fine china teacup. Prudence is largely characterized by seeking to be reasonably robust to life, like a steel travel mug. A china teacup is beautiful, but not resilient to stress and change. If we know one thing about life, it is that we must be resilient. While resilience of robustness and prudence is important, Taleb points out that robustness and fragility are not really opposites. Instead, robustness really is just indicates a lesser sensitivity to stress. The travel mug is harmed less by the fall, hardly harmed at all perhaps, but to be the opposite of fragile, it would not just have to resist being harmed, but would have to be improved by the stress and the change. Anti-fragile, then, refers to those things that are improved by stress and change. There are many examples of anti-fragility in nature. The repeated stress of walking actually causes our bones to become stronger. When you go to the gym and lift weights, the stress of the exercise causes your muscles to get stronger. If you take economics, the stress of taking the class makes you smarter. The recent fitness evolution of cross-training as CrossFit emphasizes rotating physical stresses on the body, essentially always keeping it from getting used to any one exercise to maximize the anti-fragile nature of our body's response to moderate physical stress. An interdisciplinary degree, like a master's in healthcare administration, is an excellent example of intellectual CrossFit training. It prepares you to be ready for the many challenges of the business world. Most anti-fragile things are anti-fragile within a range, of course. Too much stress can move you from the anti-fragile to the fragile range, which is where prudence comes back in. You can be injured doing CrossFit if you're not careful. You can overwhelm your capacity if you take too many courses at a given time. If Taleb put all his money in options at any given time, it would make him fragile. We have to have a sense of how much we can afford to be exposed to stress and in what range. But growth only happens through the exposure to stress. A worthy life, therefore, is an active life, not one spent sitting on a couch never taking chances. While staying at home and staying safe might look like prudence, it is in fact just another form of fragility. The lesson we can learn from Taleb, then, is that we want to be robust first, and then complement that by being anti-fragile. In many ways, the two are complementary. In the long run, we need to grow in order to remain robust. We can only do this by exposing ourselves to risks with positive upsides. Robustness takes many forms. Recognizing this requirement is a virtue of prudence, and it is necessary to ensure we comply with the minimal requirements of distributive justice. We must be physically robust by taking care of our bodies through exercise and diet. We must be robust financially. The Dave Ramsey approach to finance is one that focuses especially on robustness, and I recommend it. Taleb's approach, which I'm not going to get into here, is a little more sophisticated, but he would endorse Ramsey's approach for most people, I believe. Importantly, we must be robust with our minds and our occupations. If we have only one skill and focus only on that skill, if there comes a time when that skill can be replaced by a robot, we will be replaced by robots, as many people have been. In the 80s, people who thought their jobs and livelihoods were secure in manufacturing because they believed their tomorrows would surely be like their todays, labored under a mistaken understanding of the business world, and were devastated when manufacturing jobs went to Mexico and then went to Asia. Journalists faced a similar problem in the 90s and the 2000s as print declined and moved to the web, and as the demand for local news evaporated in favor of national and global news. Like the people in manufacturing and journalism, if what you can do can be done by a website, you better start thinking about your future. Even teachers, one of the oldest professional professions, are at risk of losing their tenured positions to computers. The world changes. To be robust, one must both constantly grow and develop the ability to change. The key is to cultivate an interest and a knowledge of many things. As a kid growing up in the 80s, we were, as a country, as afraid of the Japanese as we are today of the Chinese. The Japanese were winning at everything. Our factories were closing down because they made better cars than we did. Our electronics industry was closing down because they made Walkmans and boomboxes that were far better than anything US companies were making. And Japanese firms were buying up American icons, culminating with the Empire State Building. We were at once afraid of all things Japanese and obsessed with all things Japanese. They were winning because they were better. Like many kids of the 80s, I saw The Karate Kid, and I decided, since I was a scrawny kid like Ralph Macchio, that I could rise to self-respect by finding a Mr. Miyagi. So I started taking karate lessons, and I acquired some martial arts books, one of which was the Gorin no Sho, or Book of Five Rings, by Miyamoto Musashi. It's a drawing of Musashi here. Musashi was not a karate guy. Karate is, without meaning to insult it, a peasant art, and Musashi was a samurai. Born in 1584, by the time he was in his 20s, he was regarded as one of the great swordsmen of the Tokugawa Japan. By the time he died, he was still regarded as the greatest, by the time he died, he was and is still regarded as the greatest swordsman in Japan's history. His book, The Gorin no Sho, is about his fighting style, but it more closely resembles Sun Tzu's Art of War, for those of you that are familiar with that book, in that it focuses as much on grand strategy as it does on swordsmanship. It is still a standard read by Japanese businessmen today. In the opening passages of his book, Musashi states, "It is said the warrior's is the twofold way of the brush and sword, and he should have a taste for both ways. Bonbu ichi, or the sword and the brush are one, is a common Japanese martial arts phrase. The samurai studied calligraphy and swordsmanship and saw them both as coming from and leading to the same place, the martial way." David Lowery, a modern American master of the Japanese martial arts, describes the Japanese term do, which means the way, as both singular and universal. It is open to all with resolve and an inclination to walk it. Those who do, however, take a variety of disciplines in approaching it. For the do extrapolates from the specific to the general. So, we can follow the do through many arts, the martial arts, calligraphy, even flower arranging and the tea ceremony. The purpose of following the do, according to Lowery, is doing a thing not for the sake of doing it. It is doing a thing because it releases us from certain constraints of the limited self, narcissism, self-centeredness, preoccupation with fears and worries and doubts that diminish us in daily life. The way draws us into the domain of the potential self, self-realization, self-cultivation, and self-perfection. In other words, it is the road towards the worthy life. Here is an example of Miyamoto Musashi's own art. Note the airy style he was famous for. This is a painting done by a swordsman who is believed to have killed more than 60 men in single combat before he retired in his 40s to meditate and write. In the ground book, the first of the 5 books of the Gorin no Sho, Musashi says, "This is the way for men who want to learn my strategy. Do not think dishonestly. The way is training. Become acquainted with every art. Know the ways of all the professions. Distinguish between gain and loss in worldly matters. Develop intuitive judgment and understanding for everything. Perceive those things which cannot be seen. Pay attention even to trifles. Do nothing which is of no use." Note the simultaneous emphasis on focus and diversity. This advice is at once how to be robust and anti-fragile. It is meant to keep us focused on what matters and keep us from getting bogged down in the things that give the illusion of virtue. It also emphasizes the interplay between all knowledge. To be a better strategist, you must not study just swordsmanship, but every art. You must know the ways of all the professions, not just the way of the warrior. His last point, do nothing without purpose, instructs us to constantly examine our life. Are we cluttering our lives with things and commitments that keep us from pursuing the way? What is interesting to know is that on the other side of the world, at the same time, other men were being reborn to this same ideal. The period known as the Renaissance was blooming in Italy, even as Musashi was writing his own book, and it was preparing to sweep over Europe. One of the greatest Renaissance men who ever lived, Leonardo da Vinci, was born in 1452 in the town of Vinci, in a territory of Florence, which was under the rule of the Medici family at the time. Da Vinci is broadly considered one of the greatest painters ever, and with good reason. This is the famous Last Supper. Note the detail and the flowing movement. This is especially remarkable for its departure from medieval tradition, which shows a lack of dimension, perspective, and detail. If you remember my sheep and goats picture I had up earlier, that's a good example of medieval art. So the change here is remarkable. Perhaps one of the most famous paintings ever, the Mona Lisa, is an ongoing subject of debate. The Mona Lisa's smile is done so masterfully that we cannot ever quite see it. It seems to be about to move. Everyone knows Da Vinci was a master artist, but many people do not realize that he sold his skills as a combat engineer for many years. His art was just one of the many things he was paying attention to and learning. He designed siege bridges. He designed cannon, which he claimed in a letter to the Duke of Milan, "I can also make a kind of cannon which is light and easy to transport, with which to hurl small stones like hail, and of which the smoke causes great terror to the enemy, so that they suffer heavy loss and confusion." Oh yeah, and he made tanks. He even worked with Machiavelli on several projects, including trying to reroute the Arno River away from Pisa. Unlike Musashi, Da Vinci himself never went into the battle, but his ideas did. Nevertheless, we see a mind engaged in a wide range of knowledge. In order to be robust, he was anti-fragile. He was constantly exploring and developing new ideas, such as a pedal-powered airplane. And remember, this is the 16th century. Now, this never flew, but he had the idea. A preliminary sketch for a helicopter. He also studied anatomy with a keen eye. This drawing is known as Vitruvian Man, and it appears on the €1 coin. He conducted cadaver studies and took detailed notes unlike any that had been seen before. Da Vinci lived a life that required him to constantly extend his abilities. He competed directly with one of the other great painters of history, Michelangelo of the Sistine Chapel fame. They knew each other, copied each other, and learned from each other. They actually had a head-to-head painting competition at one point in their lives. Neither painting was finished due to changes in patrons, and this was a problem that both men faced. To do his work, Da Vinci needed to constantly seek out patrons. Once he had a patron, he had to continue to come up with works that would impress them and add value. Since patrons were fickle, and patrons' own fortunes were subject to the vagaries of the period, Da Vinci knew he might lose his patronage at any time. He had to constantly work to stay relevant and be ready to sell himself again. His diversity of interests and skills made him both robust and anti-fragile. He was always ready to take advantage of a change in the environment. I have seen it asked, was he studying anatomy so that he could get a better understanding of painting, or was he painting so that he could get a better understanding of anatomy? I think people who ask this question are often being playful, because to seriously ask this question is to misunderstand Da Vinci. The answer, of course, is yes. Yes, he was studying anatomy to better understand painting. And yes, he was studying painting to get a better understanding of anatomy. He was doing both to gain a greater understanding. It was the understanding that he was after, not just the way of either painting or anatomy. Just like the Japanese value of following the do. One studies the sword and the brush because a knowledge of both elevates you. Studying both makes you better. Again, it is the interplay of knowledge. All knowledge tends to elevate you. I learned about the idea of the Renaissance man, a man who was fascinated by all the ways of the world, all of the liberal arts and sciences as they were known to the ancients. At about the same time I first learned about the Japanese idea of the sword and the brush. It has always fascinated me that the two cultures could come to similar conclusions, and it seems that this represents a universal truth. It was around this time that I also realized that I had an example of a Renaissance man much closer than the 16th century. When I was a kid, my father was a physician and the director of the laboratory at our local hospital. In his free time, he would rebuild car engines, take apart computers, cultivate an elaborate vegetable and flower garden, and read philosophy. And when he wasn't doing all that, he volunteered as the medical director for the County Hospice Society. So he would regularly pack his black physician's bag and head out into the woods of rural New Hampshire to visit the sick and the dying. Writing 1,500 years earlier, Seneca discusses the liberal arts in a letter to a friend. He is weighing the question of why the Roman nobility gave their children a diverse education of poetry and wrestling. The common argument, he says, is that the liberal arts, the study of many fields, makes you virtuous. But Seneca did not think so. He argues that study alone does not change one's character. Why then do we give our sons a liberal education, he asks. And he answers himself, not because it can make them morally good, but because it prepares the mind for the acquisition of moral values. He says later, virtue only comes to a character which has been thoroughly schooled and trained and brought to a pitch of perfection by unremitting practice. We are born for it, but not with it. And even in the best of people, until you cultivate it, there is only the material for virtue, not virtue itself. Why did Seneca say this? Why did the idea emerge in Tokugawa, Japan, and re-emerge in Renaissance Italy? The universal truth I mentioned a moment ago seems to me to be this, that a person is more capable of virtue when he or she has greater understanding. The study of the many ways opens our understanding of the world in a way that the study of just one never can. The study of many ways does not itself make you virtuous, but it leads to greater understanding, which makes it easier to be virtuous. A deeper understanding of the world allows you to not be fooled by the respect of the mob. A deeper understanding can keep you from being trapped in a life like the office. I believe Thoreau captures this universal truth well. In Walden, he said, "To him whose elastic and vigorous thought keeps pace with the sun, the day is a perpetual morning. It matters not what the clocks say, or the attitudes and labors of men. Morning is when I am awake and there is a dawn in me. Moral reform is the effort to throw off sleep. The millions are awake enough for physical labor, but only 1 in a million is awake enough for effective intellectual exertion, and only 1 in 100 millions to a poetic or divine life. To be awake is to be alive." I believe it is our duty, our obligation to God and to ourselves, to awaken ourselves as much as possible, to make ourselves resemble works of art. All the ways, all the does lead to the awakened state if they are approached with a desire to learn. Thoreau goes on, to affect the quality of the day, that is the highest of arts. Every man is tasked to make his life, even in its details, worthy of the contemplation of his most elevated and critical hour. This, I believe, is what Seneca, Musashi, and Da Vinci were after. I believe this is what Socrates meant when he said, "The unexamined life is not worth living." Our task is to seek the worthy life, to make our lives worthy of contemplation. You may have only been given one bag of gold, but you are not to put it in the ground. Life is not fair, but life is full of choices. Mike Franz was a former student and friend. As most of you know, Mike was diagnosed with cancer during his academic year here at Army-Baylor. Despite battling a life-threatening disease, Mike not only completed his didactic studies, but completed the residency year that followed it. Everyone who came into contact with Mike was inspired by his courage, humility, determination, and generosity. Mike's father related that, especially toward the end of his battle, when Mike would wake up in the morning, he would say he may not have a choice about his conditions, but he had a choice about how he would live that day. And Mike always chose to make the most of each day. I believe this is the way toward the worthy life. We start with wherever we are, with whatever gifts and endowments we have, and we ask ourselves every day, what will I do with my one wild and precious life? The worthy life begins with a decision each morning. It begins with the decision to live a just life. It begins with the decision to respect the rules of commutative justice, to first do no harm, a phrase most of us are familiar with. Following that, the worthy life demands us to examine ourselves, our circumstances, and our gifts, to determine if we are in compliance with distributive justice. Are we making a becoming use of what is our own? Are we using all that we have to make the world a better place? Are we first ensuring that we are not a burden on someone else? Are we choosing to be robust and anti-fragile to minimize the possibility that we might become a burden? And after that, are we using our talents in a way that makes the world better and more beautiful? Every one of us has unique talents, unique endowments, and unique circumstances. While right living of commutative justice is identical across all individuals, the right living of distributive justice is completely different from one individual to the next, because distributive justice is a reflection of the uniqueness of each of us. Because distributive justice is individual, everyone's way toward the worthy life is different. While there is no one way toward the worthy life, there is one constant across all individuals. It is to examine your life constantly, and to ask if you are doing all that is in your power to pursue your way toward the worthy life. As we learned from Spider-Man, with great power comes great responsibility. Rumor has it that Uncle Ben may have lifted that quote from his reading of Voltaire without reference. But we'll let that slide. We each have great power. We have the power to choose each morning, like Mike did, to make our day good or bad, and to choose the way of the worthy life, the way of virtue, or to waste our day pursuing the approval of the mob. And in the accumulation of those days, we have the choice of choosing the worthy life or not. At the end of our lives, we each have to answer individually what we have done with our talents. 1, 2, or 5 bags, it does not matter how much you started with, but where you end. Only you will be able to answer whether you have made good use of your one wild and precious life. As Seneca says, as it is with a play, so it is with life. What matters is not how long the acting lasts, but how good it is. It is not important at what point you stop. Stop wherever you will. Only make sure that you round off with a good ending. The poet, artist, and writer Austin Kleon, author of the book How to Steal Like an Artist, offers this suggestion for success as a creative. Step 1, wonder at something. Step 2, invite others to wonder with you. I've taken up a lot of your time this afternoon, and I thank you for being gracious enough to listen to me. I have been wondering at this question of the worthy life for a long time. I believe the metaphor of the sword and the brush is a useful guide. I invite you to wonder with me. I hope you will tell me what you think. In closing, I joined the Army on April 21st, 1989. That's my lovely wife right there. I was still very much under the sway of Thoreau. Thoreau never would have joined the Army, I am certain. He wasn't a joiner. I joined the Army because it was an organization that I believed could help shape me into the kind of man I wanted to be. I joined the Army because I believed the organization's values are in line with the worthy life. I admit today that I joined the Army not because I thought I was well suited for it, but almost exactly the opposite, because I felt it could help me improve the gaps in character that were most wanting. Thoreau, in some ways, did the same thing when he performed his experiment in the woods. I will leave you with this final quote, which I would like you to take as an encouragement to find your own woods, to live deliberately, and to find your own way to the worthy life. I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life, and see if I could not learn what it had to teach, and not, when I came to die, discover that I had not lived. I did not wish to live what was not a life. Living is so dear. Nor did I wish to practice resignation, unless it was quite necessary. I wanted to live deep and suck out all the marrow of life, to live so sturdily and Spartan, like as to put to rout all that was not life, to cut a broad swath and shave close, to drive life into a corner and reduce it to its lowest terms, and, if it proved to be mean, why then to get the whole and genuine meanness of it and publish its meanness to the world, or if it were sublime, to know it by experience and be able to give a true account of it in my next excursion. Thank you for your time. I wish you luck as you pursue the worthy life.
So Mark, please be seated. Just a couple more minutes of your time. JT, you want to come? So Mark, you joined the Army to be better, but I think on behalf of all of us, I can say you've made the Army better, and I think in many ways you've made us all better. So I appreciate what you did today. So I think the students have a couple of gifts they want to present.
Sure. So I know I speak for the whole class. We truly appreciate you having been in our lives. And I'll say this: I've been a student in some way, shape, or another for a good portion of my last 20 years, and I can count on one hand those that I remember and those who have made an impact. And it's not a small thing. What you bring is that not only are you clearly interested in what you teach and what you impart, but you make it exceedingly interesting. And those are difficult qualities to find in an instructor, in a teacher, and an individual. So on behalf of our class, we truly appreciate what you do and what we know you will continue to do in your days.
Thank you, JT. Appreciate it.
We have a few things for you. We know this was on your reading list.
It is.
Perhaps what is most important.
Oh, thank you. That's
what
wonderful.
you'll find inside here.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you.
And so, now to go with these, you know you have a large book collection. You'll find the bear here.
Oh, awesome.
In the bowl. And when taken together, these two to normalize your jolly.
Oh, that's awesome. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, JT. Appreciate it. Well, we can just put them back. That's awesome. Thank you, guys. Thank you, guys. Sure, sure. Okay, why don't we just... Okay.
There we go. Where's the book? Where's the book? Say cheese, noodle, doodle, doodle. Sick 'em.
Sick 'em. Sick 'em. Oh, thank you. Thank you, gang. I appreciate it. Thank you.
So we just have one final thing that we wanted to give to Mark. And this is a gift from the faculty. So the faculty have actually pitched in. It's not in here, actually, but what is in here is a representation of what we've got you as a gift. I think you know this coming. But essentially, we got you, instead of getting you another plaque on your wall, we wanted to get you something that you would be able to remember us by every day, and something for your adventures in the future. So
thank you, Forrest. I appreciate it. Well, thank you all for coming. I appreciate your indulging me. And I'll hang out here if anybody wants to chat for a minute. But thank you. Thank you. Keep in touch, please.